All right, well, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for attending today. Welcome to Virtual Coffee with a Curator. If it's your first time, thank you so much for attending. So happy to have you. If you have, I think most of us have been attending. So thank you for joining us today. So great to see y'all. Today is we're going to have a really interesting program because for those who didn't know, the last week of September, that's usually when it falls, is Banned Books Week, sponsored by the American Library Association. And normally here in the Rare Book Room, we do some type of commemorative event for Banned Books Week. In the past, we would do usually an open house program, but I thought today would be a great time to do, of course, a virtual program. So I think it's going to be lots of fun. So I'm going to introduce and talk a little bit about Banned Books Week. But first, of course, Andrew is going to kick us off because he has his typical smirk that he has something good for us today. So Andrew, would you like to give us any hints or clues about where you are?
This is a library you may have visited before. By looking at the background, you may have actually already guessed where it is. Because there are a few clues back there. And it does have a connection to banned books. A very particular banned book, to be exact.
Okay. Are the lions a clue?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
Are they in New York?
Yes.
Oh, the New York Public Library.
That's where I am. I'm actually in the children's room.
I think, okay, yeah, good one. That makes sense. Okay.
So, Goodnight Moon, a classic children's book, was published in 1947. And the superintendent, his job as superintendent of work with children, named Anne Carroll Moore, read Goodnight Moon and hated it. She found it was too simple, lacked imagination, and was not suitable for children because it was too simple, which is, quite a statement for a children's book. She passed away several years later, but her ban on the book still stayed in effect until the 1970s, 1972. It's now one of the most checked out books in the New York Public Library's history, being checked out over 100,000 times.
And Andrew, I know that you kind of told me this story before. I think I'm still a little, so I wonder, even after the librarian passed away, everyone just, there was still, they still didn't want to shelve Goodnight Moon?
I guess so. Part of what I saw said that she was one of the earliest children's librarians of the nation, and as such became the authority figure, and that people didn't want to question her for years after her death.
It might not have been a very high priority either after she died.
Yeah.
True. I guess I was always kind of a little bit flabbergasted because I was like, I didn't know Goodnight Moon could offend someone so much. That's so interesting. But I think you bring up a great point there. That's a lot of times why, sometimes we wonder, why are these books challenged or even banned? But it just, someone voices a complaint. And that's what, Adina, Andrew he's in the New York Public Library for his background because of a Goodnight Moon controversy that I did not know existed. Apparently one of the earliest children's librarians thought that it was too simple. And did not want to shelve it for years. And then after the librarian passed away, people held on to that and still didn't shelve it. But it's circulating, of course, there. But I was just really shocked by that, actually. But yeah, I guess, someone voiced a complaint. That's usually how it starts, I guess, and many other complexities as well. But sometimes we don't always know why we're challenging something. It may not be clear completely to everybody. So that is a perfect segue, of course, into the idea behind the American Library Association's Banned Books Week. So they have a statement out about the importance of this week. So I'll just go ahead and read that. It's quite brief. And it says, Banned Books Week, this year taking place September 26th through October 2nd, is an annual event celebrating the freedom to read. Typically held during the last week of September, it spotlights current and historical attempts to censor books in libraries and schools. It brings together the entire book community, librarians, booksellers, publishers, journalists, teachers, and readers of all types, in shared support of the freedom to seek and to express ideas, even those some consider unorthodox or unpopular. So an interesting part, again, about Banned Books Week is that, of course, it's sponsored by ALA, but it's actually honored by libraries all across the country and especially in school districts as well. So I decided to pull a little something fun from the archives. Here at KSU, our library has done things over the years to make people aware of Banned Books Week. And the funny thing is, depending on the year you're looking, you can kind of like tell the time based on the books that are being featured and, are being talked about in these articles. So I pulled an article from can everyone see this? I don't know if you can see it or not. The KSU Library honors banned books.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So this is from September 30th, 2014. And this is when the library was, they did a program honoring the Banned Books Week. And I thought it was interesting because they interviewed a student who was just completely, just, shocked that Harry Potter was on the list. And then we see a mention of the Hunger Games, 50 Shades of Grey, The Perks of Being a Wallflower. So those were different challenged books that were featured in 2013 on the 2013 list, because ALA always puts out for each year a list of the top 10 challenged books for that year. And then the KSU library did a little, everyone could take a mug shot with their favorite book that has been challenged or banned. And, it's interesting too, because I think one of the people that they interviewed, they pulled out this quote that they said, "I feel like old people are convinced there's something wrong with Harry Potter morality because of the supposed witchcraft." But that's interesting because it's not just, old people. It doesn't mean old people all believe that. It's just, I think that, a lot of times that's a perception that students think, but really it's a variety of people that challenge different books each year. So I'd like to just read the top 10 most challenged books of 2020. And you can actually, and I can put the link in the chat if you're interested in seeing it, because ALA lists that out pretty very clearly. But for 2020, top 10 most challenged books were George by Alex Gino, Stamped, Racism, Anti-Racism, and You by Ibram X. Kendi and Jason Reynolds, All American Boys by Jason Reynolds and Brendan Keeley, Speak by Laurie Halse Anderson, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie, Something Happened in Our Town, a child story about racial injustice by Marianne Solano, Marietta Collins, and Ann Hazard, illustrated by Jennifer Zivoen, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, and The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. So that makes up the list for 2020. And I did some looking to see kind of what were the reasons behind it. A lot of these books, I kind of just decided to summarize it, were frequently challenged in school districts and libraries and universities because of LGBTQIA plus content, content involving racism or sexual situations, profanity and drug use. I think content that might be perceived as politically just partisan, content that features offensive language toward a group of people, or sometimes actions or statements the author made in maybe an interview or on the news or whatnot. So those were some of the reasons. However, I wanted to, and I'll put that link in the chat again so you can see the top 10 books of 2020. But I wanted to go ahead and introduce Adina Langer, who is curator of the Museum of History and Holocaust Education. And so Adina actually curated an exhibit about banned books, which was first placed in the Museum of History and Holocaust Education, and then actually came over here to the Sturgis Library for students to enjoy, which was great. So Adina, I had a couple questions for you. I wanted to ask kind of about your inspiration. So why did you decide to curate a physical exhibition on banned books in 2017?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in part I was inspired by the existing propaganda exhibits at the MHHE, when I first came on board. And I found myself thinking a lot about censorship and about justification for censorship, and what that relationship might be to wartime, but also what kind of holdovers or additional reasons that people might posit for censoring or banning content. So I started doing some research, and at that time I'd heard about Banned Books Week, but I had, MHHE hadn't done anything with it in the past, but we had just kind of launched our temporary exhibition program in 2016 with our Nourishing Survival exhibit. And so this seemed like a perfect opportunity to kind of curate a mini exhibit that would play on themes that were relevant to our mission. And then I also found myself really curious about how censorship and book banning worked similarly and differently between the United States and Germany, especially in the years leading up to and inclusive of World War II. So kind of diving into the research, I was both surprised by some of the similar reasons that the two very ostensibly different nations had for censoring or banning books, and then the areas where they differed, but also the different tactics, the different processes. And this kind of brought home how, especially during that time, 1933 to 1945, the government structures worked differently in these countries. So in the United States, because of our Constitution, it is a lot harder for government entities themselves to do the banning. Mostly there can be, even during World War II, and there are it's a lot more common during wartime for the government to bend the rules, to kind of create special bodies, special entities that take on kind of war powers. But even then, there can be challenges to that authority. So a lot of the banning tends to happen at the local level, and it or even at the industry level. So one of the things I looked at was the movie industry's code of conduct that they sort of employed during the 1930s and lasting all the way through the early 1960s. But so a lot of the time it's an attempt to negotiate kind of culture wars, for want of a better term, that have just been a part of American society forever. Whereas in Germany, it was, there were actions that in some ways mirrored this, grassroots action, university students holding a bonfire in which they burned books in 1933, but then mirrored by this top-down kind of totalitarian, intensive government. I'm not sure what word I'm looking for, not just banning, but just making something forbidden. So the creation of seizing of content, the creation of exhibits about art that was forbidden and music that was forbidden in order to foment this kind of sense of what German culture was supposed to be. So that was a long-winded answer to a good question, but yeah, it was a fascinating project to work on.
That's really interesting. And I think what you were describing, I love how you pulled out some of the similarities and differences between the two countries and the ways that they approached it, because it was interesting, the act of censorship or not, I think in wartime sometimes can be associated with patriotism for your country, because I know that, which is fascinating because books were still being challenged and maybe banned in the US during this time. But I know that with our armed services editions that we have, and for those who don't know, here in the Bentley, I wish I had brought some. I don't have them with me right now. They're downstairs, but they're these small they're these really small kind of oblong paperbacks that we have that were actually, and they say armed services editions. So they were specific editions of literature, some classic literature, some literature that maybe you haven't heard of, but it was specifically in a format that was easy for American soldiers to carry around during wartime. And I did a lot of research for this because Adina and I and Helen and one of our colleagues collaborated on a learning module about this. Interestingly, I think a lot of the people that were involved in the organizations that were involved felt like, well, in Germany, they burn books. So what are we going to do? We're going to give our soldiers books. And that's a way that we are going to symbolize our commitment to freedom. However, I mean, of course, books were still being challenged in the US too, but I find that interesting. It's like they saw that action that they didn't agree with in Germany. It was like, well, this is what we're going to do instead. And it's because we believe in freedom. So
yeah, can I share my screen for a sec?
Please
I've got
do.
a great
Please,
example of that.
Yeah.
Let me go ahead and do this. So this is a screenshot. Well, it's not a screenshot. It is the digital version of the exhibit, which I just launched this week for Banned Books Week. But one of the books that we showcase that was banned in the United States, The Postman Always Rings Twice by James Cain. It was written in 1934, and it was targeted by the Boston Board of Censors, which is this really powerful entity, very kind of Puritan in its sensibilities. And then it was also published as an armed services edition, and it was incredibly popular during World War II. So this is a really good example of exactly that kind of sort of dichotomy where, you have some groups of people in the United States who are trying to enforce a kind of morality through making it harder for people to access certain kinds of books and other content. And then this sense, it's like, freedom, this is what we're going to do. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's perfect connection. And for all of you, I'm going to put the link to the digital exhibition in the chat because it is amazing. So even though the physical exhibition has been taken down, you can still enjoy this wonderful digital exhibition that Adina has created. And I just have one more question for you, Adina, that I think might be interesting for the group to hear. So can you talk a little bit about, and I'm always interested as a curator too, a little bit about your curatorial process and how did you, there's so much to research. How did you go about researching banned and challenged books, especially since you were dealing with not just the US, but also in Germany? How did you even go about it?
Yeah, that is a great question, and there are some good resources out there, which we actually also showcase. I'm going to show you how you can find this. So we have a content section in the exhibit, and if you can go all the way down to the engagement section, and resources for further reading. This was an excellent excellent book that I used for my research, 120 banned books, censorship histories of world literature. So this book kind of was a secondary source that gathered the research of other scholars together to show which books had been banned and where and why. A really comprehensive resource if this is something that you're interested in. From the United States standpoint, the American Library Association has been publishing these lists of banned books in the United States for every single year. So I'm just bringing up this link. So their top 10 list of most challenged books for years and years. They have, an archive that goes back, even just on this website, it goes back to 2000. And then they've been collecting data about banned books since 1990, so it can be harder to find pre-1990 because this whole effort for Banned Books Week didn't start until the 1980s. But this is something that they are continuing their commitment to. So it's a useful resource, and I love also just how they include the reasons that are put forward by the various entities that are attempting to challenge or ban the book. And then you can sometimes see certain books actually have undergone, the same book might be challenged in different years for different reasons. And I think that the Diary of a Part-Time Indian Sherman Alexie book is a good example because as I recall, it's been challenged for reasons of being sexually explicit in the past, but most recently it's also been challenged for reasons of the author himself having made statements that were seen to be offensive by various groups of people. So you can kind of have challenges from the left and challenges from the right for the same exact piece of literature, which is really interesting.
That is interesting. And we've got a great question in the chat that maybe Adina, maybe you and I can. Barbara asked, are most efforts regional? How is their authority codified? And from what I understand through ALA, I think a lot of these, because and I think we say ban books, but a lot of these books, the challenge or the banning, I think is happening with a lot of school districts. Maybe parents have complained, and maybe they have asked their local library or their child's school to remove the book from a reading list or from a classroom. That's what I've understood. I don't hear about it as
mostly at that kind of regional or grassroots level, and it's schools, but it can also be public library systems, which is interesting to me. That's where I think things get certainly dicier from a constitutional standpoint, because these are public libraries. They're ostensibly for adults, for people of all ages. And there isn't really like a curricular reason that you can put forward that things should or shouldn't be recommended for particular people. And nevertheless, there are often these grassroots efforts to have books removed from the shelves of public libraries.
And I noticed that, which surprised me, but ALA also had mentioned that they found that some books were challenged also in universities, and you don't find that as much, of course. But I imagine maybe a university that perhaps is trying to adhere to a specific religious, they have a certain religious affiliation or whatnot. Perhaps that could happen at that level as well, probably just rarer. But yeah, I think they are generally pretty regional. It's a great question. Well, Adina, those were all of the questions I had for you, but I'd like to open it up to the group. Does anyone have questions for Adina about her exhibition on banned books, or about the digital exhibition that she created this year, or about any type of curatorial work that she's done regarding challenged books or banned books?
I have to leave. I'm sorry, but I wanted to let Adina know that in my office on the wall, I have the spectacle of the degenerate, the from the panel from your show, from the exhibition, because as an art history major, I learned so much in my undergraduate about band art, and the spectacle of the degenerate, the art show that Hitler had to show. He hung up pictures that this is what you don't want to do. But then it became one of the most popular art shows in the country because people were like, let's go see what they want to do, And so he kind of defeated his purpose, So.
Yeah. And I think that that's one of the central ironies that I think, you indicate, because, every time I would read about, oh, this book was banned in Boston, it's like, okay, everybody wants to read that book now. And similarly, the Degenerate Art Show in Munich in 1937, and then the Degenerate Music Show in 1938, these were way more popular than the celebration of pure German culture shows that were actually happening at the same time, like right across the street. Everybody wanted to go see what was seen as bad, or and specifically this whole idea of degenerate. I mean, it's a weird term, but it is one that I will say I also found really fascinating and ironic, because it the Nazi Party wanted to prove or wanted to show that everything that had been created in German culture by Jewish scientists and by Jewish artists was fundamentally corrupt in some capacity. This was really central to the Nazi ideology. So a lot of the books that were thrown into the fires and the book burnings of 1933 were books that were just happened to be written by Jewish people, but many of them were on the forefront, or the vanguard of modern physics and modern psychology. And a lot of these theories around what is degenerate culture, culture that is somehow stunted or undergoing some kind of negative change, are at least in part pulled from discussions from these contemporary psychologists, many of whom were Jewish. Not that they didn't have this simplistic notion that the Nazi Party kind of adapted. It's like, oh yes, this is degenerate, this isn't, etc. But the concept itself kind of came from this way of looking at human psychology, which was started especially by a lot of Jewish scholars. So there's no way around this looking ridiculous, frankly, when you examine it, and yet the power of this party and this movement to use in a lot of ways terror. This is one of those pieces. It's like, it doesn't have to make sense if we're throwing it into a fire. You can see that we are trying to make you afraid. And likewise, you can be attracted to this art, but we are the ones who are in charge, and we're putting it up on the walls in these like awful kind of scary ways. You can see this is a good example, this image here of
they had like propaganda and stuff like written on the walls of the gallery, right? But that's what that is.
Exactly. It was really, it's like the images are hung at funny angles. I mean, it almost reminds me, like if you tune into some kind of sensationalist news program and they're like, dun, 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 black mold, whatever it happens to be. These kinds of techniques are still popular to try to elicit like an emotion. But yeah, so sort of separating out the material itself from what the desired effect was, can be an interesting exercise, when looking at this stuff.
That is just fascinating. Thank you, Maggie, for bringing that up about the art. That was really important. Thank you.
It was one of my favorite things in my art history classes.
Yeah.
But, I'll see you guys later.
Okay, bye, Maggie. Anyone else have questions for Adina or comments?
I have a question. How often do these regional efforts reach over into the arts, go beyond books and into the arts?
That is a great question. And I'm not sure. However, I imagine that probably just as often. I would maybe, I mean, I would think perhaps, I mean, I think books tend to be, I guess they're probably just more prevalent among especially younger audiences. So that probably happens more, but I don't know. I mean, I know a lot of art kind of pushes the envelope quite a bit and might make certain people feel that they need to push back. But I actually don't know exactly I don't have like my finger on the pulse of how often that happens. But
I'm trying to think, there was a recent case that the Southeastern Museums Conference put out a statement because, and I don't want to be inaccurate, but there was a state archives, I believe, that had published kind of a celebratory list of LGBTQ artists and resources, and the state received pushback from kind of a very vocal public group and took it off their website. I think it was a digital exhibit. And then obviously then the kind of museum community and archives community rallied around saying that that was the wrong move and kind of counter protesting. I think, I mean, I would want to do more research into this, but my feeling is that more frequently that kind of thing takes place in the form of protests or boycotts, or, you know, like, don't go see that show, don't go see that movie, because it's not in as fixed a form, you know, as a book where you can be like, take it off the shelves. It's more, you know, it's more ephemeral, or it's in a particular place, or we shouldn't like donate to that organization anymore. Because, and I remember reading about that, certainly with you know, the Guggenheim Museum in New York certainly encountered a number of wealthy donors who would threaten to withhold funding if they pushed the envelope too much. So certainly these ways of kind of influencing what culture gets a wide showing is pretty fluid. It's not like so clearly like banning or, you know, especially in the United States, but I do think it happens in the arts all the time.
Helen, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you want to, do you think you could maybe say a little bit about the lips together, teeth apart controversy that happened in Cobb County in, I think like 93?
Sure. Hello. The basic outline of the story is that a local theater, Theater in the Square in Marietta, put on a play called Lips Together, Teeth Apart, that featured not even a gay character, from what I understand. It was more that homosexuality is mentioned in the play. And people who saw the play reported this back to a Cobb County commissioner, who then basically took it up as a personal crusade to, he created a resolution that was ultimately passed by the Cobb County Commission that called itself a family values resolution, but it was in fact just anti-gay. And then what they took issue with next was the fact that the play received some public funding. The theater received some public arts funding. And the commission tried to see if they could direct public arts funding only to endeavors that met their kind of family values metrics. And when they discovered that they could not do that, they instead decided to ban all arts funding for Cobb County. And that money was redirected to the police department. So I believe 11 arts organizations lost public funding as a result of that, including Theater in the Square, which Theater in the Square turned out okay because they received many private donations as a result of this because it was such a high profile incident that was covered heavily in local and even national media. But there were, of course, other organizations that missed out on quite a bit of funding. And I don't know at what point public arts funding was restored. I think it was, because I think that there are currently publicly funded things in Cobb County today relating to the arts. But it was a very big deal, and a lot of the protests against these resolutions did call them out for censorship. So yes, that does relate.
Thank you so much, Helen. And yeah, I'm sorry to make you put you on the spot there, but I thought it was just too relevant to miss it. So in the chat, I've put the archival collection that we have here for Theater in the Square, where you can find, if you're interested in that specific instance, you can find more information about the records we have documenting that. So anyway, wanted to kind of just show y'all that. But I wanted to just wrap it up and say with Adina, thank you so much for sharing with us, your process and about some of the actual content of the exhibition. And that's another thing. I'm going to put the link to the digital exhibition in the chat. I hope everyone has a chance to go through it and to enjoy it, because it's really great.
Yeah. So one other thing, I just want a quick shout out to Acapella Books in Atlanta. I don't know how many of you have been there or worked with them, but when I decided on the list of books that I wanted to include in the exhibit, I reached out to the owner of Acapella because they do a lot of trade in used books, and basically said, what I'm looking for are copies of these books that are maybe not first edition, but certainly kind of close to publication, but that also have interesting covers, because I want them to be, visually appealing when they're displayed, and they found really wonderful books. So all of those books are actually in the MHHE collection. Now, that being said, I can always, we can talk about whether that makes sense, but that's where, so if you're interested in any of the books that you see in that digital exhibit and want to thumb through them or look at them more closely, they are in our collection.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you so much, Adina. Just so great. So if you have any follow-up questions for Adina, please feel free to put those in the chat. I want to make sure everybody gets their questions or comments addressed. For the remainder of the time, I just thought we could just have a little informal chat about some frequently challenged and banned books that most of us would consider literary classics. And because we know that many of those are books that we have read or that we've heard of. And sometimes you have to think for a minute and you're like, oh, think about why would this have been challenged? And then when you think about it, it's interesting to see what different people have decided is inappropriate. So there's an entire list of 46 classics that are frequently challenged that ALA put out. And so I selected just a few of them, and a few of them that we have here in the Bentley Rare Book Museum, a few interesting copies that we have, and I thought we could chat about it. So the first one is actually a pretty new acquisition for us. It's this beautiful copy of Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. So I was really, really happy to get this one. It's in beautiful condition. Love the dust jacket. Sorry for the glare. It's in Mylar. But if you haven't heard of Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, it was published in 1952. It is the author's first novel, and it was the winner of the National Book Award for that year. And it is a seminal work in African-American literature. So I think that it's one of those books that if you were taking a class in African-American literature, you most likely would be reading that one. The cool thing about this particular copy, though, is I'm going to be careful, is that it has an inscription in here to Al, and it's from, of course, an inscription from Ralph Ellison to Al and Jean Wolfe. So get this, it was interesting connection. So Al Wolfe was a political activist, and he was the brother of a man named Bernard Wolfe. Bernard Wolfe was a writer, and he was also a bodyguard for Leon Trotsky. So it was just a fascinating connection there. But basically, this novel, I have not finished this one. I started reading it here. This is one that, again, is a gap on my reading list. I've never read this one, so I want to do it. But when I had to kind of stop because I was at work. I was like, let me see this a little bit. It is so good. I mean, you're not going to be able to stop. It is so good. It's just captivating. But it addresses many pressing issues facing the Black community in the early 20th century, particularly Black identity, deals with some Marxism, the impact of racial policy, things like that, things that can be a little bit, of course, uncomfortable to talk about. And so according to ALA, let me pull this up. I had it in my computer kind of. Okay. So according to ALA, this book was especially challenged over the years because of, I think, images of violence and sexuality, profanity. A lot of this was in high schools where it was on the reading list, and parents decided that they didn't want their students reading it. So that is Invisible Man. Another, and this one may not surprise you, but another one that has been very frequently, I think, kind of questioned and challenged is Gone with the Wind. This one, it does not have the dust jacket, but Gone with the Wind. And even, I feel like even as recently as, I think, last year, when I think there was a controversy with the movie even being played. But Gone with the Wind, I know a lot of you are very familiar with this book and with the movie. So just a cool thing about its publishing, it's very interesting because if you have a first edition Gone with the Wind, or you're looking for one, the first edition first printing numbered only 10,000 copies. And they actually had an incorrect release date that said May 1936. But then they fixed that with the second printing, which was 25,000 copies, and they said June 1936. The crazy part was, I think they were all actually released at the same time. However, if you're a book collector, you want, it's rarer and, it's more coveted to have the May 1936 printing, or the May 1936 printing date, even though that was, I guess, technically incorrect. So, and so if you have a signed first edition Gone with the Wind, in case there's one laying around your house, those, and I think with the dust jacket, I believe, those are valued from between like 10 to 25,000. So if you're wondering, if you happen to have a signed first edition lying around, that one is probably very high value, of course, depending on its condition. And so anyway, so ours, we've got a variety of copies of Gone with the Wind. What I think is interesting here, we don't have a first edition with a dust jacket, but what I think is cool is that someone who owned this book before decided to paste like a newspaper clipping, I think talking about, something about Margaret Mitchell. And anyway, people do this a lot. They will paste newspaper clippings inside of books and things that are relevant to the story or to the author. And then also the book had a lot of these, which we put in Mylar, but a bunch of these newspaper clippings related to the book, actually. So that was also hiding in there. So I find that to be fascinating. And you can see where they had put the original newspaper clippings because we see the acid transfer here. So that's where the clippings were at one point. So as we all know, and as most of us know, Gone with the Wind, again, very popular 1939 film featuring stars like Vivian Leigh and Clark Gable, was enormously popular. One of the, I think, the best I think one of the most popular films ever, actually. It was the first color film to win an Oscar, and Mammy, played by Hattie McDaniel, was the first African-American to be nominated for and win an Oscar. So it's interesting, though, when we think about why Gone with the Wind, what has been challenged, it wasn't challenged all the time, but I think a lot of it was the use of of derogatory language, use of the N-word. So I think in some school districts is really so people arguing or whether or not this was suitable for youngsters to be reading. And so anyway, that's that one. Wanted to just go over that. Another one that we have in the collection that I remember, I think I read this in, I don't remember if it was high school or if it was college, but Richard Wright's Native Son. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of this or read this one before. So Richard Wright, again, one of the most well-known African-American writers of the 20th century. It was published in 1940. So we've got a first edition, but just a later printing, and ours lacks the dust jacket. So I really like this quote by one of my favorite booksellers. Says, along with Ellison's Invisible Man and Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, Native Son is one of the indisputable mid-century classics of African-American literature. But it is divided into 3 different books, Fear, Flight, and Fate. So the actual protagonist is named Bigger Thomas. And he's an impoverished Black youth who basically ends up fulfilling the violent stereotypes that are historically associated with Black men. And the novelist, Richard Wright, he kind of unpacks the systemic racism that almost leads to this self-fulfilling prophecy. And I'm not going to lie, it is an intense novel to read. I remember being very uncomfortable while reading it. And there are some parts of it that are very shocking. So it was a bestseller, but it was also heavily criticized, not just by, maybe angry parents, but actually by Richard Wright's, maybe his contemporaries and friends, like James Baldwin was one of the critics of it as well. I think a lot of people felt that while Richard Wright was revealing one of the darkest parts of, the Black experience, he was also maybe perpetuating stereotypes. So interesting. But this one, I think, was challenged mostly for language violence and for sexually explicit content. So we're starting to see kind of some themes here, especially in schools. Another one that Adina actually, and also I'm sorry, I almost missed Ellie's comment about Invisible Man. Oh, interesting, resembles a musical piece with ebbs and flows. That's fascinating. Thank you so much for adding that, Ellie. I really look forward to reading it. Wonderful. Thank you for that comment. But another novel that Adina featured in the digital exhibition on Banned Books is For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. So we have in the Bentley, we have a lot of copies of this. It was also published in 1940, October 21st, 1940 to be exact, by Charles Scribner's Sons. First edition consisted of 75,000 copies. So cool thing, you have a true first edition. If you have it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little A right here. During this time, Charles Scribner's and Sons, they would always put a little A right there for their first editions. And so that's pretty cool. But anyway, so this book is set during the Spanish Civil War. And if I'm not mistaken, I think this one, according to, I think, ALA, I think this one was declared non-mailable by the U.S. Post Office in 1940. Adina, do you know about that?
Yeah, that was one of the weirder things that I kind of discovered, was this sort of go around when it came to federally mandated banning. There was this kind of loophole in which items could be declared non-mailable without the government specifically saying like you can publish it, but no, we can't distribute it because it's like subversive. And this was more common, I think, when there was seen to be a threat in terms of communism or socialism, these kinds of themes that the federal government felt were dangerous at kind of this national level. That was one of the more common reasons why that they could say, like, yes, this is non-mailable.
Interesting. So yeah, that's fascinating. So that was one interesting one. So again, these are all the explanations are listed on the ALA website. Last one I wanted to highlight was one that we received actually pretty recently, just a donation. It's a first edition, probably a later printing, but it doesn't have the dust jacket. But y'all may have heard of Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Versus. I think many of us, and for those who don't know Salman Rushdie, I think his has a really, really interesting collection that is a digital collection that uses an emulation at Emory University. So if you've ever wanted to see that, to see, I think, his computer in its original environment, you can go do that at Emory University in their special collections. But The Satanic Versus was Rushdie's fourth novel, published in September 1988. And on February 14th, 1989, Iranian leader Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa or religious edict stating, basically kind of condemning Rushdie to death for the content of the Satanic Verses, which he determined was very offensive to the Islamic community. So Rushdie actually had to go into hiding. And so I don't know the status of the Satanic Verses now that we're, over 20 years after, but I think it was banned in many Middle Eastern and African countries. I don't know if it still is, but was because of its criticism of Islam and just a variety. So it caused, I think some people even died in riots and protests about the novel. So it produced quite a bit of ruckus. And so that was one that was actually dangerous, very dangerous for many who were involved. So anyway, those are just a few examples of challenged books in the rare book collection, some literary classics that we would consider that have frequented the list. And as we read earlier with the top 10 of 2020, some of those, like To Kill a Mockingbird, have been read in schools and have been out for a long time, but are still being challenged, and sometimes for different reasons, sometimes for the same reasons. And Barbara, that's a good question. How did they enforce the non-mailable? I'm actually not.
Yeah, I put in the chat an article from the UCLA Law Review, which goes into a little bit more depth on like this whole designation of non-mailability and this idea of things being obscene, but it mostly dates back to the Comstock Act in 1865, which allowed there to be criminal penalties for people who are trying to use the mail to communicate obscene creations. So it's one of those things like obscene, what does that mean? Well, obscenity is often in the eye of the beholder, which is what makes this dubious from a constitutional perspective. But anyway, it gets in the weeds, but it's an interesting article.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adina. So that's really what I wanted to show. Does anyone else have comments about challenged books or banned books or any personal experiences with books that were challenged in their schools or libraries? I don't think, if that happened to me in school, I don't think I ever knew about it. I mean, I didn't attend PTA meetings, of course, then, but there might have been, absolutely.
I know that my 11th grade English teacher said that she taught The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera, which has a lot of like fairly sexually explicit content for for that book, and also like a lot of language. And she did say that a parent had come in one day like saying, how could you have my child read this book? And like she prevailed, and the continued teaching the book. So it wasn't necessarily a successful ban, but like definitely a challenge.
But a challenge, yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Helen. Anyone else?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Joy Ellen's mom, and this has been a wonderful discussion. I just wanted to share, Joy, you may or may not remember when Harry Potter came out years ago. I just remember amongst parents, you know, you would hear some parents that just thought it was not a good thing. And then you'd see others whose children were just reading those books. They loved it. And, you know, you would see children with just buried in the books. So that was an example of just, I guess, seeing at a grassroots level, parents having a different viewpoint on what was okay.
Interesting. That is, and actually that's been one of the books that has been, if you go on the ALA website, the Harry Potter series has been one that has been frequently challenged. And, you know, again, it's not like it's like, and I'm assuming, I don't think Harry Potter, I don't know if that's ever been on like a reading list for, you know, coursework, but in terms of like, you know, I don't know, advanced reader lists or featured in libraries. I mean, yeah, that's for most kids are going to want to see that. And so, yeah, I think I do maybe, I mostly remember people just reading them. I don't know if I remember the parental discussions, but thank you. That's really interesting. Anyone else before we end for today?
I know that this sometimes just happens at like a like classroom level, you know, just in terms of like what the norms and the standards of. So I know like my son's class, his elementary class, a lot of the kids were really into the Diary of a Wimpy Kid, and the teacher like put an end to that. I haven't actually read it myself, so I don't really know what the issue is, but it was just like she was like, no more Diary of a Wimpy Kid, you have to read something else. So
yeah, that's a good point, I think. And actually, Mom, I think you have a story about that, because I think you were the challenger of a book in my sister's, remember that book that they never finished about, which I understand, it was a book, I think they were reading it for story time. Was she like in first grade or kindergarten?
Yes.
Yeah, and it was a book about, and we went to a school that was, you know, predominantly white, and we were like the only Black children in our classes usually. And there was a book about a kid, about why I think a parent brought the book for story time. And it was a book about why this child hated being Black. And I think at the end, it kind of, you know, the child was taught to why they should love being African American, but something happened with story time and they never finished the book. So what they got, these first graders, what they got was why this child hated being Black, but they ran out of time, or they had to have lunch or something, never finished the book. And so, Mom, what did you do?
Well, I did, the big thing was our younger daughter, who was in the class, came home and told me how uncomfortable she felt. So I did, I emailed the parent, said a prayer first, because I was a little bit really confused on why this was happening, but I did, and the teacher was very wise. She did explain to me how the book transpired. But Joy, you're correct. I think something stopped and they didn't finish the whole book, because I think the little boy figured out or was taught why he should value who he was. But I think it was just what our daughter heard was the part that made her feel very uncomfortable. So I think I handled it well.
Yeah, I think so. So had to kind of speak up. Although I think my sister said that they never did finish the book. I think the teacher just wanted to kind of abandon it altogether and read a different one. But so I don't know, it's one of those things where do you finish it or do you go back? So it can get really muddy. But anyway, I know it's after 11. So I think this has been a great discussion. So thank you all so much for joining us during Banned Books Week, and make sure you check out the ALAs, a lot of their resources they have about banned and challenged books. And thank you, Lori. It looks like, Obscene and Anti-Family for Diary of a Wimpy Kid, which I thought was a really popular series for kids. Yeah, so interesting. You just never know what you're going to find on the list. So anyway, thank y'all so much. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.